I think it's safe to say most of us can't imagine life without Spotify or Apple Music or, whatever your streaming service is.
Yeah.
But while we're busy creating, those perfect playlists,
Yeah.
have we ever stopped to think about how this whole streaming thing has, impacted the musicians themselves? Are they better off or worse off?
Yeah, it's really a question a lot of people are asking. And the truth is it's kind of a mixed bag for musicians. Some would say it's been great, others not so much. There's evidence for both sides.
Okay, so let's break it down. I mean, we all remember buying CDs, but then things kind of took a nosedive. Did streaming come in and save the day? Like, a digital superhero?
Well, it definitely helped the industry financially. I mean, for like 14 years, revenue was declining steadily, but then streaming came along and boom, everything changed. By 2019, global revenue had climbed to over $20 billion, largely thanks to streaming subscriptions. So, yeah, it was a pretty big comeback.
So more money for the music industry should mean more money for the artists, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But it's not that simple. The problem is the money isn't being distributed evenly. It's kind of like a winner take all kind of situation where the superstar artists at the very top, they're the ones grabbing, most of the streaming revenue.
Ah, so it's that age-old music industry problem again. The rich get richer, and everyone else is left fighting for scraps. So is streaming making that problem worse?
There's definitely a worry that it is. You hear a lot about those low per stream payouts that places like Spotify offer, but it's more complicated than that.
Okay, so if it's not as simple as, per stream rate equals struggling musicians, what other factors are we talking about here? What actually determines, how much a musician earns from all this streaming?
Well, it's kind of like a puzzle with lots of pieces. First, you've got the total revenue that the streaming services bring in, from those monthly subscriptions and advertising, of course.
Okay, so that's like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I guess.
Right. And then you've got the deals between the streaming platforms and the rights holders. Those are usually the record labels and music publishers. Those deals determine what percentage of that revenue actually goes to the people who, own the rights to the music.
So even if a streaming service is making tons of money, a big chunk of that might never even get to the people who made the music.
That's a big concern. And then on top of that, you've got the contracts between the musicians and their labels, and those contracts decide how much of that money actually goes to the artist.
Wow, so it sounds like a pretty tangled web. Is it even possible for musicians to make a good living in this system? Especially if they're not, already famous.
It's possible, but it requires thinking about income streams differently. Like, think about it as more people subscribe to these services, that total revenue pie keeps growing. So even if the per stream rate stays the same or even goes down a little, an artist can still earn more if their music gets more streams. More listeners, means a bigger slice of the pie, even if each slice is getting a tiny bit smaller.
That makes sense, especially if you're an artist with a, dedicated fan base. But I gotta say, those per stream rates still feel kind of insulting, compared to what musicians used to make from CDs.
I think a lot of people feel that way, but it's important to remember that CD prices were often inflated. Some argue that per stream rates might actually be closer to how much people value individual songs. It's like if you're only going to listen to one song from an album, maybe you shouldn't have to pay for the whole thing, right?
That's an interesting way to think about it. It kind of challenges that, whole musicians are getting ripped off narrative.
Exactly. And don't forget that most musicians aren't just relying on streaming for income these days. Live shows, merch, even platforms like Patreon where fans can support their favorite artists directly, those are all becoming important for a musician's bottom line.
So maybe it's not all doom and gloom for musicians in the streaming world, but let's be honest, the music industry has always been about, who has the power, right? You've got these big players calling the shots, and then you have smaller artists trying to get their share. So is streaming making that dynamic worse?
That's a good question. Some critics argue that features like those recommendation algorithms and those curated playlists, they actually might be designed to help the big labels and those superstar artists stay on top.
So instead of streaming leveling the playing field, it might actually be making the old power structures even stronger.
There's definitely a chance of that. Think about it. The algorithms are designed to serve up what's popular, what's already getting a lot of streams. So it creates this feedback loop where the same artists and songs keep getting pushed to the top, and lesser known artists, they struggle to get heard. It's like a popularity contest where the winners keep winning just because they're already winning.
So how does a truly unique artist even get discovered when algorithms and playlists are, running the show? It seems like a tough landscape to break through.
Yeah, you're right. It is a challenge. But it's not impossible. There are still ways for independent artists to make their mark in the streaming era. We're seeing more of these direct to fan platforms and independent distribution companies that are helping artists, bypass the old label system and connect with audiences on their own terms.
That's good to hear. It sounds like even though streaming has made things harder for musicians in some ways, it's also opened up some new doors and given them more control.
That's a good way to put it. It's a complex landscape full of opportunities and pitfalls, but ultimately, listeners have a lot of power to shape how this all plays out. What we choose to listen to, how we engage with music, and where we spend our money, it all makes a difference.
That makes me think about something I'm sure a lot of our listeners are wondering. What can we as music lovers do to actually support the artists we love in this new world of streaming? What can we do that really makes the difference?
There are a few simple but really effective things you can do. First, remember that streaming is just one part of it. Go beyond just listening on Spotify or Apple Music. If you really love an artist, go see them live, buy their merch directly from their website, maybe become a patron on Patreon, where you can actually contribute directly to their creative work. Things like that make a big difference, and it creates a much stronger connection between you and the artist.
It's like taking your, fandom to the next level. It's more than just passively listening. It's about actively supporting their success.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing you can do is be more adventurous with your listening. Don't just stick to the same old playlists and recommendations. Explore different genres, seek out independent artists, discover new music on platforms like Bandcamp. The more you broaden your musical horizons, the more you support a more, diverse and vibrant music ecosystem.
So expand those playlists, be open to new things, step outside your comfort zone. What else can we do to be more thoughtful about how we listen to music?
Don't be afraid to get involved in the bigger conversation. Support organizations that are fighting for fairer artist compensation and more transparency in the music industry. Make your voice heard, demand a system that truly values creativity and makes sure musicians are treated fairly.
So be informed, be active, be vocal. It sounds like we can all play a part in making things better.
Even small actions can have a big impact. Shifting even just a little bit of your listening towards those lesser known artists or, directly supporting an artist you love, those things can really make a difference. Remember, every time you hit play, you're kind of casting a vote for the kind of music industry you want to see.
It all comes back to being a conscious consumer, right? Making choices that reflect what we value and, our love for music. It's like, you know, choosing to buy fair trade coffee or supporting local businesses. It's putting your money where your mouth is.
And speaking of, making a statement, what song has taken on a whole new meaning for me after this conversation?
What's that?
Fight for Your Right by the Beastie Boys.
Interesting choice. Why that one? Well, maybe it's not just about partying anymore. Maybe it's about fighting for your right to hear different voices, to support the artists you love, to have a music industry that's, fair and full of life. What do you think?
I think that's a great way to look at it, and it's a perfect way to lead into the next part of our conversation.
We've been talking about, how streaming has kind of turned the music industry upside down, especially when it comes to how musicians make a living. And now I kind of want to peek behind the curtain a little bit and see, how this whole system works. Who are the big players pulling the strings and how do they all, fit together?
Well, you can't talk about the music industry without talking about record labels. They've been around forever, and even in this digital age, they still have a ton of power.
Yeah, when I think of record labels, I think of, those massive companies like Sony, Universal, Warner, the ones with, all the big name artists. Are they still the ones calling the shots, even in the streaming world?
Oh, absolutely they are. They're often called the Big Three, and for good reason. They control a huge chunk of the music market, and their influence, extends to the streaming world too.
Okay, so how does it actually work? Do streaming services like Spotify just go directly to these labels and, get permission to stream their music?
It's a little more complicated than that. Streaming services need to get licenses from whoever owns the rights to the music, and that's not always the artist. A lot of times it's the record labels that hold those rights, especially for artists who are signed to, one of those big labels.
So when an artist signs a contract with a label, part of that deal gives the label control over, their music rights.
Exactly. And those contracts can be all over the place in terms of, how much power they give to the artist versus the label. Some artists manage to hang on to more control, while others might sign away more of their rights. It's all part of the negotiation.
So the labels are like the middlemen. They go to the streaming services and hammer out a deal on behalf of their artists. But here's what I don't get. If a streaming service pays a label for a song, how much of that money actually ends up in the artist's pocket?
That is the $1,000,000 question, and unfortunately it's often a big secret. You hear a lot of talk about transparency in the music industry, but the truth is a lot of these deals between the labels and the streaming services, they're like locked in a vault protected by, those non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah, those NDAs always seem to pop up when things are a little shady, don't they? So basically, we're in the dark about how much the labels are taking and how much the artists are actually getting. Is there any way to get a clearer picture of how this money is being divided?
It's tough. There have been some, efforts to shed light on these practices, but the industry is really good at keeping things under wraps. It's even possible that some artists themselves don't even fully understand how their streaming revenue is being split.
That's kind of scary, isn't it? A system that's not transparent like that could easily be abused.
Yeah, it's a valid point. And that lack of transparency can make it harder for artists to, fight for their fair share. And it can keep those power imbalances we were talking about, in place. If musicians don't even know how their music is being monetized, it's hard to push for better deals or to, hold the labels accountable.
It feels like we're talking about this black box where money goes in and who knows what comes out. But it's not just record labels we're talking about, right? There are those organizations that handle the royalties for songwriters too. Do they play a role in all of this streaming stuff?
Oh, absolutely. Songwriter royalties are managed by these organizations called performing rights organizations, or PROs for short.
Yeah.
ASCAP and BMI are the big ones in the US.
So they collect royalties for songwriters whenever their music is played, publicly, whether it's on the radio, in a bar, or, in this case, on a streaming service.
Exactly. They're like a collective bargaining agent for songwriters. They negotiate with anyone who uses music and make sure the creators get paid.
So do streaming platforms have to make separate deals with these PROs on top of the deals they make with the record labels? It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, it's a multi-layered licensing cake. Streaming platforms have to get licenses from both the record labels, who usually control the rights for the actual sound recording, and the PROs, who handle the rights for the, musical composition itself. It can get pretty complicated.
So for every song that gets streamed, there's money going to the record label, money going to the PRO, and hopefully some trickling down to the artists themselves. But again, with those NDAs, we don't really know how much is going where.
Right, that lack of transparency is a problem there too. And it's not just the lack of transparency, it's the power that those big players have. The big three record labels and those dominant PROs, they have a lot of leverage when it comes to making those deals.
It sounds like a system where a few powerful groups can just dictate the terms and potentially squash any competition. It makes you wonder if the artists are really getting a fair shake.
It's a valid concern, and that's why there's been a lot of talk about, potential reforms, ways to create a more balanced and equitable system that benefits, both artists and listeners.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. What are some of the ideas that are out there? How can we make things a little more fair for the artists?
One of the big things people are talking about is, you guessed it, transparency. There are more and more calls for, more openness in those licensing agreements between streaming services and right holders. Letting some light into those deals could give artists a much better understanding of how their music is making money, and maybe give them more power to negotiate for, better terms.
Yeah, transparency seems like it should be a no-brainer, right? More information helps everybody. What else is on the table?
Another idea that's gaining some traction is moving to a user-centric model for how streaming revenue is distributed. Right now, most platforms use what's called a pro rata system, where all the revenue is pooled together and then divided based on overall market share. But a user-centric model would take that revenue and give it out based on how individuals are listening.
So instead of my monthly subscription fee being split among, every artist on the platform, it would go directly to the artists whose music I actually listen to. That makes a lot more sense to me.
Right. It would create a more direct link between listeners and the artists they're supporting, and it would be a lot fairer to, those niche artists and those who haven't quite hit superstar status yet.
Sounds like a win-win. What other solutions are people thinking about?
There are a lot of smart people working on this. Some folks are calling for the government to step in and, regulate the industry to try to fix some of those power imbalances we were talking about. Others are looking to new tech like blockchain, as a way to create more transparent and fair systems for tracking and paying out royalties.
It's encouraging to see so much innovation happening. But are there any artists or organizations out there already pushing for change within the current system? Are they finding ways to, you know, make things better without waiting for some big overhaul to happen?
Absolutely. A lot of artists are speaking out about these issues and demanding to be treated fairly. They're using their platforms to raise awareness and, shake things up a bit.
Can you give me some examples? I always love hearing about musicians who are, leading the charge for a better music industry.
Well, you might remember when Taylor Swift pulled her music from Spotify back in 2014. That was a huge deal at the time. She was protesting their, artist compensation model, and it really brought the issue of streaming royalties into the spotlight.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It felt like a real turning point.
It was, and she's not the only one. Plenty of other artists, big stars and independent musicians alike, have been vocal about the need for fair pay and more transparency. They're realizing they have a voice and that they can use their influence to push for change.
So artists are finding their power. That's great.
Yeah.
Are there any organizations out there specifically dedicated to fighting for musicians' rights in, this digital world?
For sure. Organizations like the Future of Music Coalition and the Artists' Rights Alliance are doing great work. They're advocating for policy changes, promoting transparency, helping musicians understand, all the complexities of the digital music world. It's like they're providing a roadmap for artists trying to find their way in this new territory.
It's awesome to see artists and organizations teaming up to try to create a more just system. But what about those independent artists and labels we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
The ones who are going around the traditional system. How are they making it work?
There's been this huge surge in platforms and services that let artists connect with fans directly and put their music out there without going through the whole major label thing. Bandcamp is a great example. It's become a real haven for independent artists to sell their music straight to fans, and it gives them more control over their pricing and how their revenue is split.
So it's like they're cutting out the middleman and going straight to the source. The people who are actually listening to their music.
Exactly. And it's not just Bandcamp. Platforms like Patreon are letting fans directly support their favorite artists through subscriptions, and independent distributors are helping artists get their music on streaming services without needing a big label deal. It's like a whole new ecosystem is popping up outside of, the traditional industry structures.
Feels like a real power shift is happening. But if all these independent platforms and services are getting bigger, how are the major players reacting? Are they adapting to this new world, or are they, digging in their heels?
Oh, they're definitely paying attention. They're still the big dogs in the industry, but they see that things are changing. They're investing in new tech, experimenting with different business models, even partnering with some of those independent platforms and services. It's like they're trying to stay relevant in a world that's changing really fast.
So it's less of a battle between David and Goliath and more of a dance where everybody's learning how to, coexist and adapt.
I think that's a great way to put it. The music industry has always been changing, always evolving with, new technologies and listening habits. The rise of streaming is just the latest chapter in that story.
So we've talked about the money, the power struggles, the challenges and the triumphs of musicians in the streaming world. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, I think, that we need to talk about. Technology itself. Is the thing that's really driving this whole streaming revolution. And it's not just changing how we listen to music. It's changing how music is made, how it's discovered, even how it's experienced, like on a really basic level.
Yeah, technology is definitely changing the musical landscape. And you're right, it's not just about how we consume music, it's really impacting, the whole creative process.
When I think about technology and streaming, the first thing that pops into my head is algorithms. You know, those things that seem to know what I want to listen to even better than I do.
Right, they're like that friend who always puts on the perfect song at the perfect time. Algorithms are a huge part of how these streaming services work. They're the brains behind those personalized recommendations, the curated playlists, even what we hear on the radio.
It's kind of freaky how well they can predict what I'll like.
Mm.
How do they do that? Like, what's the secret sauce?
Basically, they're these massive data crunchers. They look at tons of information. Your listening history, what you skip, what playlists you follow, even the time of day you're listening. All that data gets fed into the algorithm, and it uses some pretty complex math to predict, what other songs or artists you might enjoy.
So it's always learning and adapting to my listening habits. It's like a musical mind reader that just keeps getting better.
Yeah.
But isn't there a downside to all this personalization? Could these algorithms be trapping us in these little bubbles where we only hear music that we already like?
It's definitely something to think about. There's a lot of debate about how algorithms might be limiting our musical exploration and reinforcing, our biases. That's not great for discovering new artists or expanding our tastes.
It's weird to think that we have access to millions of songs, but we could end up listening to less variety because of these algorithms. Is there any way to break out of those bubbles?
Well, some streaming services are starting to realize this is a problem and they're trying to add more, randomness and surprise to their recommendations. They're experimenting with features that encourage people to, try something new.
I love those moments when a song or artist I've never heard of just pops up and blows me away.
Mm-hmm.
It's like finding a hidden treasure. But technology's impact goes beyond just discovery, right? It's changing how music is actually made, too. I keep hearing about artificial intelligence and, how it's being used in music production. Are we going to have computers writing hit songs soon?
AI is definitely making waves in the music world. There are AI tools out there that can compose music, create melodies, even, generate pretty realistic sounding vocals. It's pretty wild.
It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. Does this mean human musicians are out of a job? Is AI going to replace, the creativity that makes music so special?
I don't think we're there yet. AI can be a cool tool for, coming up with ideas and helping with production, but it's still missing that human touch, those emotions, those stories, those experiences that make music, really resonate with us.
You're right. Music is so much more than just sounds. It's how we express ourselves. It's how we connect with each other. And that's something that's really hard to replicate with code, no matter how smart it is. But I wonder, could AI change how we define creativity itself?
Mm.
What happens when we can't tell the difference between music made by humans and music made by machines?
That's a question that's going to keep a lot of people up at night, I think. As AI gets more and more sophisticated, we might have to rethink what we consider creative and, who we consider the author. It's new territory and it's exciting, but also a little scary.
It feels like we're on the verge of something totally new in music.
Mm.
But beyond all the cool tech and the, potential disruptions, what does all this mean for the future of music itself? Is it going to change how we connect with music on a deep level?
I think it already has. Streaming has made music more accessible than ever before. We can listen to practically anything with a few taps on our phones. But sometimes all that easy access can make us feel a little disconnected. When music is just another thing, we're streaming, something to shuffle or skip. Do we lose something important? Do we lose that sense of connection, that, deep appreciation for the art form?
Yeah, it's like the difference between mindlessly scrolling through social media and having a real conversation, right?
Yeah.
You can be entertained, but you miss out on that deeper connection.
Exactly. It's important to be aware of that, to make an effort to really listen to the music, to savor it, to think about all the creativity and hard work that went into making it, to be present with the music instead of just letting it fade into the background.
That's such a good point. Maybe the most important question isn't about technology, but about how we choose to use it.
Mm-hmm.
We have all these amazing tools, but it's up to us to use them in a way that makes our experience of music better, not worse.
I couldn't agree more. We can have the convenience and the possibilities without forgetting what music is really all about.
It all comes back to being mindful about the choices we make as listeners and as creators. What are we listening to? How are we supporting the artists we love? What kind of music industry are we creating through our actions?
Those are the big questions. And I can't wait to see how it all plays out.
Me too. And as we figure out how to navigate this crazy new world of music, maybe we can all take inspiration from a classic song that feels more relevant today than ever. Fight for Your Right by the Beastie Boys. Fight for your right to hear different voices, to support the artists you believe in, to build a music industry that's fair and alive.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Let the music keep playing, and let's all do our part to make sure it has a bright future.